I never thought my life would change with a crumpled piece of paper from a gas station, but here we are. It was a Thursday night. Nothing special, just me grabbing cigarettes and a soda after a long shift. On a whim, I spent the last $20 in my wallet on scratch-offs and a single lottery ticket. I didn't even check it that night. The ticket sat on my kitchen counter for days, under unopened bills and pizza coupons. That weekend, I scanned it at the self-checkout, and the machine just froze. Then, in big, bold letters, claim at lottery office. My heart started pounding. I thought maybe I'd won a couple grand. Enough to cover rent, maybe fix my busted car. When the clerk checked it, she looked up at me like she'd seen a ghost. She leaned in and whispered, "Sir, you need to go to the state office. This is big." Turns out, big meant $42 million before taxes. I walked out of that office with papers in my hand, trying not to faint. The first thing that hit me wasn't joy, it was fear. Fear of what this money would do to my life. Fear of how my family would react. I grew up with 3 siblings, and let's just say the relationships were complicated. I'm the youngest, but not the baby everyone spoils. More like the punching bag. My eldest brother, Daniel, is the golden child, wealthy, respected, smug as hell. My sister, Rebecca, is the manipulator, always scheming, always making herself the victim. Then there's Emily, the youngest besides me, sweet but broke, always barely getting by. For years, Daniel and Rebecca treated me like trash. Lazy, irresponsible, a loser. I can't count how many times they laughed about me never getting my shit together. Every family dinner felt like sitting through a roast where I was the only target. And the worst part? Our parents sided with them most of the time. So standing there with a winning ticket worth more than all their salaries combined, a thought hit me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. What if I don't tell them? And not just that, what if I tested them? Because here's the thing. When you've been made to feel worthless your whole life, there's a dark part of you that wants proof. Proof of who actually cares. Proof of who would throw you a rope when you're drowning instead of pushing your head under. I swore to myself in that moment. If they betray me, I won't just cut them off. I'll make them regret ever looking down on me. I'd fake overdue rent notices, print out fake medical bills, let them see my car get towed. I had a buddy help me with that. I'd show up vulnerable, asking for help. Not much, just a few $100 here and there. Enough to see their real colors. And I'd record everything. I bought a cheap pen with a hidden microphone and practiced using it in my apartment. I downloaded apps that automatically recorded calls. It felt sneaky, borderline paranoid, but I knew my siblings. If they were going to tear me apart again, I wanted receipts. That night, sitting in my crappy apartment with a secret worth millions, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not just control, power. And I promised myself I wouldn't waste it. I told myself to move slow. Revenge isn't a firework, it's a slow chemical burn. If you rush it, it fizzles and leaves you looking like a fool. So I lit the first match carefully. I made my life look worse than it was, and I made sure everyone could see. First step, optics. People believe paper. I printed overdue notices that looked official, rent, utilities, a bogus dental bill that read like the sort of thing people get when they avoid the clinic for years. I left them on the kitchen table where my siblings would inevitably spot them during the random visits I engineered. I posted vague statuses that hinted at hardship without outright begging. Can't catch a break. I wrote once, then another time. If anyone knows someone hiring. Next, the car. My old hatchback had been on its last legs for months. I called a guy I knew who runs a tow service and paid him to stage a repo in broad daylight while I played distraught. I filmed it from inside my apartment window. The footage was rough, but it would do. The tow truck driver was in on it. He waved at me like a neighbor as he hooked the bumper, and the neighbors watched, whispering. Within 24 hours, the story had the right feel. Humiliating, public, believable. Then came the phone calls. I started with Daniel. Oldest, loudest, the one who used to tell me to grow up, like it was a magic spell. I rehearsed what I would say, ran out of options. Rent's due. Can you help with a couple hundred? Simple. Human. Keep it short. Keep my voice cracking just enough to sound real. He answered on the second ring. The tone casual, the laughter already there. I could hear people in the background, his friends, or maybe coworkers. He asked a few probing questions, then paused. Why didn't you get a job? You're always screwing around. I can't just hand you money to fix your life. He chuckled, and that laugh might as well have been a slap. I kept my voice steady, begged a little, let him walk away with his judgment. I didn't play the victim too long. Misery is exhausting and believable only for so long. Rebecca was worse. She invited me over to talk, but the entire meeting felt like interrogation. I arrived with the envelope of fake bills tucked into my jacket. I let them sit visibly on her kitchen counter while she sipped coffee and tilted her head like a courtroom stenographer. "You always make bad choices, Alex," she said. "I think you thrive on drama." When I mentioned the repo and the rent notices, she rolled her eyes and suggested I sell my stuff or stop being dramatic. She didn't even ask how bad it was. She framed it as entertainment. I left with a hug that felt like a handshake, polite and dead. Emily, on the other hand, was different. She met me at a cheap diner, sliding a paper bag of coffee and 2 folded 20s across the table. Her hands trembled when she pushed the money toward me. "It's not much," she said, eyes glossy. "I sold my watch. Don't tell Mom." She tried to sound casual, but the way she avoided looking at me told me more than words ever could. She pawned a little thing because she thought I needed help. No one had ever looked at me like that, concerned, ashamed for my sake. It gutted me and warmed me at once. I pocketed the money like any actor would pocket stage props. Throughout this slowly staged collapse, I recorded everything. Hidden mic in my jacket, apps that save calls automatically, the tow footage, the quick videos I shot of the overdue envelopes spread across my kitchen table like evidence. I told myself I was building a case. The recordings were ugly in the best way, raw, unedited proof of tone, of dismissal, of contempt. They captured the pauses and the laughs, the eyes that slid away when family gossip started, the quick checks for reputation over compassion. But there were things the camera couldn't catch. The little moments, the way Daniel's voice softened the second Emily walked in and told him my story in private. The way Rebecca clutched her pearls when a neighbor mentioned someone in the family having problems. The filthy satisfaction on my face when a cousin asked if I had done something wrong. Those were the small, human exchanges that made me hate them more than a headline ever could. I watched them each react differently and cataloged it like some perverse archivist. Daniel's indignation read like arrogance. He wanted to appear above it all. Rebecca's manipulation took the form of moral grandstanding. Preach, then abscond. Emily's help was clumsy and honest. Watching their choices, I felt this cold, precise certainty. When the time came, the consequences would match the sins. Not draconian, not criminal, but sharp, public, and final. Playing the victim was exhausting in ways I didn't expect. It gnawed at me when I had to fake the shaking in my voice, when I had to look over my shoulder to make sure the tow guy wasn't early. There were moments I wondered if I'd crossed a line. But every time I felt that doubt, I thought of the years of being dismissed, of birthdays ignored, of hearing my name get swallowed by louder ones, and the doubt faded like fog. What I learned in those weeks was simple and ugly. Humans reveal themselves when it costs them nothing. Give someone enough soapbox and the world is going to hear what they really think. I was giving my siblings a cost, not in money, but in reputation, in the inconvenience of feeling embarrassed by association. The recordings would be the price they paid for their words. By the end of the month, my ruin had become common knowledge. People at work asked about me, cousins dropped hints at family gatherings, and the small, cruel jokes started to circulate. But despite the shame I manufactured, I kept a secret. My bank account was empty by design. The real money sat behind layers of legal advice and quiet trusts. The next phase would require patience and the same coldness I'd used here. The willingness to let people show themselves and then to respond. Revenge, I told myself, isn't a tantrum. It's a transaction. And I was buying the truth with receipts. If you've ever had that one sibling who thinks they're better than everyone else, you'll understand exactly who Daniel is. He's the kind of man who wears his success like cologne. Thick, choking, impossible to ignore. At family gatherings, he'll drop the price of his watch into conversation the way normal people drop the weather. He doesn't just own his achievements, he weaponizes them. For years, he used me as a punchline. At Thanksgiving, while carving turkey with his gold wedding ring glinting, he'd say things like, "You still living in that shoebox, Alex," and everyone would laugh. It was always good-natured teasing according to Mom. To me, it was years of being reminded I didn't measure up. So when I picked up the phone to call him, The recorder running in the background, I already knew what was coming. What I didn't know was just how far he'd go. I caught him on a Friday evening. The background was noisy, glasses clinking, male voices booming with that cocktail of beer and arrogance. He answered like he was already smiling. "Alex, what's up, man? Haven't heard from you in a while." I swallowed hard, forcing the script I'd rehearsed. "Hey, I hate to ask, but I'm in a bad spot. Rent's due, car's gone. I need some help. A couple hundred, just to get through this month." There was a pause, and for a split second I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd hear compassion. Instead, Daniel let out a laugh. Not nervous laughter, not the kind people use when they're uncomfortable. It was genuine, belly-deep laughter, and his friends joined in without even knowing the joke. "Jesus Christ," he said between chuckles. "You're calling me for beer money again?" My face burned, though I was alone in my apartment. "It's not beer money." He cut me off. "Alex, you've been a screw-up since high school. I can't just throw money at your laziness. Grow up. Get a real job. Hell, maybe join the army. At least they'll feed you." More laughter erupted in the background. I let silence sit heavy between us. He wasn't done. He put me on speaker. I know because suddenly his voice echoed and I heard someone mutter, "Oh, it's the broke brother." Daniel spoke louder, for his audience. "Listen to this guy. He's begging me for rent money because he can't keep a job longer than 6 months. Classic Alex." The laughter stabbed harder than the words. It wasn't just ridicule, it was spectacle. He was using me, live, as entertainment. My humiliation was the punchline in a bar full of half-drunk men. I forced a quiver into my voice, just enough to make the recording sting. "I'm serious, Dan. I'm going to lose my place." He snorted. "Not my problem. You've had enough handouts. Grow up." And just like that, he hung up. I sat there, phone buzzing in my hand, every muscle tight. My ears burned with humiliation, my jaw ached from clenching. But beneath the shame was something sharper, a kind of cold fire. The recording was perfect. His laughter, the jeers of his friends, the smug dismissal. It wasn't just rejection. It was betrayal with an audience. Later that week, I saw him. I dropped by Mom's house knowing he'd be there. He was sprawled on the couch, beer in hand, bragging about a new contract at work. When he saw me, he smirked. "How's the job hunt? Or did you come to raid Mom's fridge?" The room chuckled, and I bit down hard on my tongue. I didn't answer. I didn't have to, because I wasn't there for his words anymore. I was there to memorize his arrogance, to let it brand itself into my memory. Every smirk, every scoff was just fuel. On the drive home, I replayed the call on my car speakers. His laugh filled the small space, echoing back at me until it almost felt unreal. But it wasn't. It was my reality. Years of being the family fool distilled into one perfect, damning moment. That was when it hit me. Revenge wouldn't just be about proving I had money. Anyone can flash cash. No, real revenge would be making sure Daniel's own words destroyed him. The same voice he used to belittle me would be the one that dragged him down. I didn't feel powerless anymore. I felt patient. Because patience is what turns humiliation into ammunition. And Daniel had just loaded my clip for me. Rebecca always had a talent for making people believe she was incandescently reasonable, the one who keeps everyone together, the family diplomat with a soft voice and a hard edge. Her kindness was performative, like a costume she put on when cameras were near. I'd grown up seeing the costume up close. The way her eyes flicked when she measured what to reveal, the small, practiced sigh that signaled she was about to deliver a verdict dressed as advice. So when I started my slow collapse, I knew Rebecca would play both parts, the savior in public, the saboteur in private. I decided to let her in a little, not because I trusted her, but because she needed to feel superior. I called her, voice raw enough to make her worry, but not enough to trigger pity. "Becca, rent's due, and I'm out of options. I don't want to ask, but can you help?" I kept the line soft, the script practiced. She asked the right questions, the kind you answer when you're pretending you care without committing to action. "How long has this been going on? Have you tried asking Mom? Maybe you need to get serious, Alex." She sounded composed, which in her case meant she was already building a narrative. She invited me over the next day under the pretense of figuring it out. When I arrived, she was all warm smiles and a casserole that smelled like Sunday afternoons. She folded me into a hug like a missionary folding a map, efficient, directional, and with a plan for where to press. Midway through dinner, she leaned back and said the words I'd expected. I might be able to help, but you have to be honest with me. No more drama. It was what I wanted to hear, so I gave her just enough honesty. The repo, the notices, the pawned watch from Emily. I watched her face, waiting for the softening that would indicate she actually cared. Instead, she tilted her head and spoke with a surgeon's precision. You always do this, Alex. You dramatize things to get attention. You thrive on chaos. If you would just be responsible, she paused. I could lend you some money, but you'd have to sign something. A note, something to make sure you're serious. That line, you thrive on chaos, was a familiar one. It was the same phrase she used at Thanksgiving after someone told a joke at my expense. But now it was sharpened into leverage. She proposed a loan with conditions that read more like a trap. Cosigners, monthly check-ins, restrictions on spending. I played grateful, accepted a nominal amount she offered, and thanked her as if I'd been saved. Later, while organizing my apartment, I found a string of texts that shattered the little patience I'd been keeping. Rebecca had messaged cousins and a few neighborhood acquaintances, outlining my pattern of instability and suggesting discreet ways to distance themselves. Don't lend him anything, one text read. Another suggested a more public route. If he starts making a scene, we'll have to show we're not enabling him. It was surgical smear campaigning, small, precise, designed to make me look unworthy of help. The proof was worse than the words. She wasn't just refusing to help. She was making sure no one else did either. She wanted to free herself of obligation and also to make me radioactive, so anyone who reached out would be judged for it. Where Daniel's betrayal had been loud and public, Rebecca's was secret and systemic. He humiliated me for sport. She strangled me with procedure. There was another layer that cut deeper. Rebecca had always been careful to maintain relationships that mattered for status. PTA presidents, wedding planners, people whose opinions could flatten a person. Her little notes to them were not casual gossip. They were preemptive strikes intended to ensure I never received unsolicited help, that I would remain the family scapegoat for as long as she deemed convenient. That knowledge pushed something cold and precise through me. Daniel's loud cruelty had given me ammunition. Rebecca's quiet sabotage mapped the perfect architecture for how to use it. She'd spent years building a polished exterior that protected her from consequence. The recordings and messages I'd been collecting could dismantle that exterior in a way a shouting match never could. Revenge, in my head, stopped being about petty humiliation and started to feel like corrective clarity. Not vindictive for the sake of cruelty, but surgical. Rebecca had weaponized reputations to keep herself safe and to punish anyone who threatened the narrative she lived inside. If I exposed her, the fallout would not be theatrical screaming. It would be the slow, devastating erosion of credibility. People would start to ask why she'd warned them away. They'd read her texts. They'd see the pattern. I didn't rush. I cataloged. I labeled audio files with dates, saved screenshots with timestamps, made sure every piece of evidence had context. The plan wasn't to destroy her life, but to show who she really was to those who still believed in her little costume of reasonableness. When I left Rebecca's house that night, the casserole dish in my hand felt heavier than it should have. I'd eaten her food and swallowed her patronizing words. But I'd also walked out with more than a small loan. I had proof. And proof is a slow kind of power. Before I went to bed, I replayed the recordings and read the messages again. The anger had cooled into something else, a meticulous calm. This wasn't about payback in the sensational sense. It was about balance. Rebecca had spent years tilting the scale. I intended to level it carefully, so the truth would do what her pretenses never could, make people choose who they really wanted to be around. She would continue to be charming in public. That was her advantage. But behind that charm was a ledger, and I had found the entries. The next steps would be quiet, precise, and very public in consequence. Of the three, I had believed in Michael the most. He was the youngest, the one I'd protected when we were kids, sneaking him food from the kitchen when he was too scared to ask, covering for him when he broke Dad's tools in the garage. He used to trail behind me like a shadow, wide-eyed and eager, always looking up as if I were some kind of shield between him and the world. That bond, I thought, would be the strongest. That bond, I thought, would save me from disappointment. But disappointment has a way of finding you. When my troubles deepened, I went to him not with schemes, not with invented startups, but with the simplest request. "Mike," I said one evening over coffee, "I just need a little help to get through this month. Nothing big, just someone in my corner." I didn't dress it up, didn't exaggerate. I spoke the way I used to when he scraped his knee, direct, honest, hoping honesty would mean something. His reaction wasn't cruel like Daniel's, nor polished like Rebecca's. It was something colder, avoidance. He fidgeted with his phone, tapped the table, and gave vague answers that shifted the burden away from him. "You know how tight things are for me right now? I'm saving for a new place. I don't really have the flexibility." I nodded. Even though I knew his paycheck was steady, his expenses modest, I knew he had room. What he didn't have was willingness. He didn't want to entangle himself in someone else's struggle. Helping meant admitting I mattered as much as his goals, and in that moment, he chose himself without hesitation. The final cut came a week later. A neighbor mentioned seeing Michael out with friends, laughing over drinks, tossing bills on the bar like he had more than enough to spare. My request hadn't been impossible. It had merely been inconvenient. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the silent phone, waiting for a text that would never come. If Daniel's betrayal was fire and Rebecca's was ice, Michael's was smoke, suffocating, invisible, slipping into every corner until I could hardly breathe. His betrayal wasn't in what he said, but in what he didn't. He didn't stand up. He didn't reach out. He didn't care. I decided not to push him, not to argue or beg. Instead, I would let him reveal himself more clearly. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, Michael came by, not to check on me, but to borrow my old guitar. He smiled sheepishly, the same way he used to when asking me to cover for him, and said, "I've been wanting to pick it back up, just for fun. You don't mind, right?" It was almost laughable. When I had asked him for something, he had turned away. But when he wanted something, he came without hesitation. I agreed, of course. I even carried the case down to his car for him, hiding the bitterness behind a tight smile. As I watched him drive away, my decision solidified. Michael wasn't malicious, but he was selfish in a way that cut just as deep. His betrayal wasn't grand or theatrical. It was casual, careless. And sometimes, that kind of betrayal leaves the deepest scars. I began to document these small moments, just as I had with Daniel and Rebecca. The refusal, the careless spending, the borrowing without giving back. They might seem minor on their own, but together they painted the picture of a man who valued convenience over loyalty. A man who could shrug off family ties the second they became heavy. The evidence wasn't as explosive as the others, but it didn't need to be. Michael's downfall would come not from a single devastating blow, but from the slow revelation of his indifference. People believed he was kind, quiet, dependable. Showing them how quickly he turned his back would be enough to shatter that image. I didn't want him to suffer in the same way I planned for Daniel and Rebecca. No, Michael's punishment would be subtler. He would lose the very thing he had always relied on, the perception of being the good one, the youngest, the innocent, the one who could do no wrong. That mask, once broken, could never be repaired. And so I waited. I watched him post smiling photos online, holding my guitar, strumming chords with friends who cheered him on. He looked carefree, unburdened, as if my existence had never weighed on him at all. Each image only fueled my resolve. For years I had carried him, protected him, shielded him. Now I carried something else. The quiet, certain knowledge that when the time came, I would let the world see who Michael really was. Not the harmless younger brother, but the one who turned away when it mattered most. And when that truth came out, he would learn that sometimes silence can be the loudest betrayal of all. By the time I reached the 6th week of my little masquerade, I knew the time for subtlety was over. I had tested them individually. I had watched Daniel sneer at me, Rebecca twist her knife with false concern, and Michael simply drift away into apathy. The evidence I had collected was damning, but evidence alone wasn't enough. I wanted them to expose themselves fully, together. That's when the idea of the confession dinner came to me. It would be the stage on which their masks slipped for good. I invited them all over, dressing it up as a desperate cry for help. I told them I had something important to share, that I needed their advice more than ever. I cooked again, the same way I had before, only this time the food was simpler, plainer, like a man too strapped for cash to afford anything fancy. I let my apartment look disheveled, bills on the table, unopened letters scattered around, a few props I had created to sell the illusion. fake loan statements, overdue rent notices, even a fabricated letter from a debt collector I had designed on my laptop. When they arrived, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Daniel scanned the papers almost immediately, smirking at my staged chaos. Rebecca tried to look sympathetic, but I caught the glint of calculation in her eyes. Michael looked uneasy, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Once they sat down, I cleared my throat and began my act. "I need to be honest with you," I said, keeping my voice low and shaky. "I'm in trouble. More trouble than I can handle. I owe money to people who don't play nice. Loan sharks. If I can't pay them back soon, I could lose everything, or worse." The silence that followed was suffocating. I named a number, large enough to sound frightening, small enough to be believable. Their reactions were telling. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "That's on you. I'm not throwing good money after bad." Rebecca pursed her lips. "You realize this could drag us into a mess, right? If people find out we're connected to you, it could ruin our reputations. My career, Daniel's business deals, Michael's stability, it's all at risk." I lowered my head, hiding the satisfaction in my smile. They were afraid, not for me, but for themselves. Exactly as I expected. Only Michael spoke up with something resembling concern. His voice cracked slightly. "Alex, maybe I can help. Not much, but I can figure something out." His eyes darted nervously toward Daniel and Rebecca, who immediately cut him down with a sharp glare. "Don't be stupid, Mike," Daniel snapped. "You can't afford to get dragged into this." Rebecca added, "If Alex was irresponsible enough to borrow from criminals, why should we all suffer for it?" And just like that, the youngest sibling's tiny spark of loyalty was smothered by the older two's cold fire. I let the conversation spiral, each of them digging their heels deeper into self-preservation. Daniel suggested I cut ties with the family for damage control. Rebecca insisted I should man up and face the consequences alone. Michael stayed silent after that, guilt written across his face, but no words leaving his mouth. By the end of the night, I had exactly what I needed. Not only their refusals, but their explicit willingness to sacrifice me to protect their own images. When they left, I walked them to the door, thanking them in a voice that trembled with false defeat. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder like he was sealing a coffin shut. Rebecca gave me a cool, professional nod, already thinking about how to spin my downfall to her advantage. Michael avoided my eyes entirely. As soon as the door closed, I pulled out the small recorder I had hidden under the table. Every word, every sneer, every cold dismissal, captured in crystal clarity. Proof not just for me, but for the entire world when the time came. I sat alone in the dim light of my apartment, listening to the recording on repeat. Each time I heard their voices, the anger flared again, but alongside it was something sharper, satisfaction. The trap had been set. They had walked into it willingly, exposing every ugly part of themselves. For years, they had treated me like the family disgrace. Now I held the power to rewrite the narrative. And soon enough, I would. The trap had been laid, and they walked into it without hesitation. But I knew better than to think one night's conversation would be enough to expose them fully. People like my siblings didn't crumble all at once. They chipped away at themselves slowly, showing cracks only when pressure mounted. So I let the pressure build. I went quiet for a few weeks, feeding them only tidbits of my situation. I mentioned late-night calls from collectors, hinted at threats on my doorstep, even staged a voicemail or two with the help of an actor friend. I made sure just enough smoke was visible for them to believe there was fire. And it worked. The paranoia spread. Rebecca was the first to break. She called me one afternoon, voice tight, rehearsed. "Alex, I've been thinking, maybe it's best if we take a step back. Professionally, socially. If word gets out about who you're involved with, it could reflect badly on all of us. You understand, don't you?" I nearly laughed at the word us. There was no us, not in her mind. There was only her, and the spotless image she polished daily for the world to admire. But I didn't laugh. I sighed, pretended defeat. "Yeah, I get it. I wouldn't want to ruin anything for you." Daniel was less subtle. He invited me to lunch at one of his favorite upscale restaurants. His way of showing off, as always. "And if you get dragged down, we get dragged down with you." "That can't happen." I stirred my water, forcing my hands to tremble slightly. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time you distance yourself from the family. At least until this all blows over. Change your number, Lay low, don't come to family events. Out of sight, out of mind. It's the only way. The audacity of it almost stole my breath. Cut myself off from the family to make their lives easier. They weren't just unwilling to help, they wanted me gone entirely. Disposable. An embarrassment to be erased. Michael was the last. He came to me one evening, his face pale with guilt. Alex, they're right. I hate to say it, but maybe staying away for a while would be better, just until things settle. His words were softer, hesitant, but they landed just as heavy. I had always thought of him as the quiet ally, the one who might still stand with me. But in the end, he bent too. They always bend when the choice is between someone else's survival and their own comfort. I let their words wash over me, each one a blade carving away the illusion of family. It hurt, yes. It cut deeper than I'd expected. But underneath the sting was steel. Because with each rejection, they handed me exactly what I needed. Undeniable proof of who they truly were. The recordings piled up. Rebecca's clipped tones about reputations. Daniel's blunt dismissal over whiskey. Michael's reluctant agreement. Together they formed a symphony of betrayal. A chorus that would play loud and clear when I pressed play. The masks had finally slipped, and what lay beneath was uglier than I had ever imagined. Not just selfishness, but cowardice. Not just indifference, but eagerness to erase me completely if it meant preserving their fragile images. That night, I sat alone again, the apartment silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine and raised it to the empty room. To family, I whispered bitterly. For years, they had spoken about loyalty, about sticking together, about how family comes first. They used those words as leverage when it suited them. But when it was my turn, when I was the one who needed the lifeline, they tore it from my hands. I knew then that my plan wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about balance, about showing them, and everyone else, that the person they had dismissed as weak, foolish, and disposable had been holding all the power all along. Soon, they would walk into another dinner. Not in my crumbling apartment this time, but in a place that would strip them of the illusion of superiority. They would look around and realize the tables had turned, literally. And when I played back their words for an audience far larger than they ever expected, the world would see them as I did. I drained the glass, the bitterness burning in my throat. The masks had fallen, and when the curtain rose on my final act, there would be no hiding left. I sent the invitations carefully, like a general calling a meeting of his enemy's generals. A single line in each message, "Come by for dinner. I have something important to show you." No details, just enough to pique curiosity and ensure they would arrive, eager to assess how much trouble I had fallen into this time. When the day came, I spent hours preparing. But this wasn't about cooking or ambience. This was about optics, about presence, about making the truth undeniable. I wore a tailored suit, crisp and dark, shoes polished until they gleamed. The apartment had been swapped for a rented luxury mansion for the night, valet outside, a fleet of cars parked like trophies along the driveway. I walked through the halls, servants adjusting silverware, subtle music humming in the background, and felt a thrill that had nothing to do with money. This was the power of narrative, the satisfaction of letting people see what they had dismissed for years. Daniel arrived first, glancing around with mild amusement, expecting chaos or despair. His smirk faltered the moment he saw the mansion, the black luxury sedan, and me, leaning casually against the marble counter with a glass of champagne in hand. Alex," he said, the casual tone forced. This is nice." "Yes," I replied smoothly, pouring another glass for myself. "It is, and it's all mine." Rebecca arrived next, radiating the same polished concern she always carried, ready to spin her way into superiority. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the opulence, but the moment passed, replaced by the practiced mask of control. I invited them to sit in the dining room, my voice calm, almost conversational. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you all here." I let the pause stretch, their silence amplifying the tension. "It's simple. I wanted to show you something. Something you should have seen a long time ago." Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the recordings. Daniel mocking me, Rebecca plotting behind my back, Michael's small refusals disguised as concern. I placed the player on the table, pressed play, and let their words fill the room. The effect was instantaneous. Daniel's eyes widened, disbelief cracking his composed facade. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. Michael lowered his gaze, unable to meet the sound of his own voice admitting indifference. "This," I said, voice steady, "is exactly what you said when I needed help. Every word, every laugh, every suggestion to cut me off. And here I am." I gestured around the room, letting my hand glide over the crystal glasses, the polished floors, the expensive art. "Everything you thought you judged me for, poverty, struggle, need, has been your misjudgment. I have money, power, resources, and none of it comes from you." Daniel swallowed, lips twitching as he searched for words. You lied? All this time?" I smiled, faint, almost cruelly. "No, and now you have." Rebecca stepped forward, trying to regain composure. "Alex, this doesn't. I mean, we can." "No, Rebecca, we can't. Not after everything. Not after the years of mockery, manipulation, and betrayal. Tonight is not about discussion. It's about clarity." Michael's voice was barely a whisper. "Alex, I didn't mean. You didn't act," I said, cutting through him gently but firmly. "You didn't stand by me. You didn't even try." I let silence fill the room, heavy and suffocating. Then I leaned back, allowing the moment to sink in. The mansion, the cars, the wealth, none of it was just about money. It was about exposure, about truth, about letting them see that I had been underestimated, dismissed, and written off. I needed them to feel the sting of their own actions reflected back at them. And tonight, in this room, I had begun to do just that. The night of the reveal had been satisfying, but I knew it was only the beginning. Seeing their faces as they realized I had been lying about my struggle was thrilling, but the real payoff came when the world could witness their own words against them. I had prepared for this meticulously, every recording cataloged, every message saved, every detail timestamped. I decided the stage would be a small gathering, close family, a few mutual friends, and some professional acquaintances who had always respected Rebecca and Daniel. Michael would be present, not to be humiliated, but to see the weight of complicity when he had chosen inaction. The invitations were vague. Dinner at Alex's, an important family discussion. They arrived expecting another confrontation, not the unveiling of their own failures. I began casually, serving drinks and light hors d'oeuvres. Their discomfort was visible, even as they tried to maintain composure. Daniel shifted in his chair constantly. Rebecca's eyes darted nervously around the room, and Michael avoided my gaze entirely. "Perfect." I set the tone with a simple statement. "I've been reflecting on family, loyalty, and trust. I also realized I have some recordings and messages that illustrate exactly how those qualities have been handled by certain people here." A murmur ran through the small audience. I didn't pause. I let it sit. Then, I played the first recording, Daniel's mocking tone as he dismissed my struggles, laughing at the idea of loan sharks or financial danger. His smugness was undeniable, his laughter cruel. The room reacted immediately. A cousin gasped, a friend frowned. Daniel froze, unable to speak. Next came Rebecca. Her voice, calm and calculating, detailing the ways she had warned others to avoid helping me, the careful manipulation of perceptions, the emails and texts meant to isolate me. People's eyebrows shot up, whispers forming as her carefully crafted image of the reasonable, caring sister crumbled in front of their eyes. Finally, Michael. His refusal to help when I asked for assistance, the small justifications, the avoidance, all laid bare. The audience could feel the betrayal in his voice, the guilt that he had tried to hide. It wasn't explosive, it wasn't loud, but the quiet weight of his inaction spoke volumes. By the time the last recording finished, the room was silent, save for the occasional cough or shifting chair. The tension was almost tangible, the truth settling on each of them like a cold weight. Their expressions were a mixture of shame, panic, and disbelief. They were seeing themselves not as they wished to be, but exactly as they were, selfish, cowardly, indifferent. I stood, letting the silence stretch, then spoke calmly. "This is who you were when I needed help. Every insult, every refusal, every calculated avoidance is preserved here, not only for me, but for anyone who wants to know the truth. Loyalty is not given freely. It is tested, and each of you failed in spectacular fashion." Daniel's hands trembled as he tried to explain, but his voice cracked under the weight of exposure. Rebecca's attempts at smoothing the situation with excuses fell flat. Michael remained quiet, head down, unable to reconcile the guilt pressing against him. Then came the consequences. Daniel had been in talks for a business partnership, one that required discretion and integrity. The audio clips were forwarded discreetly to the contacts he had relied on. The deal was quietly withdrawn within hours. Rebecca, ever conscious of her image, found herself suddenly questioned by colleagues and family alike. Her reputation as the sensible, reliable one fractured. Michael faced the subtle judgment of friends who had always trusted him, seeing now the quiet selfishness he had shown. I didn't gloat. I simply observed, letting their own actions, now public, speak louder than any word I could utter. The revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was precise. I felt no need for reconciliation. Satisfaction came from the certainty that justice, measured and deliberate, had been served. They had shown me their true colors, and I had reflected them back in a way they could never ignore. The power balance had shifted, the debt of betrayal had been repaid, and the world now knew the truth. The exposure of Daniel, Rebecca, and Michael had been satisfying, but it was only part of the plan. Revenge, I realized, was not merely about destruction. It was about reshaping the world so that truth and loyalty were rewarded, and deceit carried consequences. I had the evidence, I had the money, and now it was time to finalize the arrangement. The first step was straightforward. I restructured my finances to ensure they would never touch a cent of my fortune. Offshore accounts, trusts, investments, all legally sound, invisible to prying eyes, untouchable. Everything I had worked for could not be seized, borrowed, or manipulated. Daniel's business partners, Rebecca's colleagues, even Michael, none could influence the path I had laid. Next came the public part. I established a series of charitable trusts and scholarships, each in the names of my siblings. It was brilliant in its subtle cruelty. The world saw generosity. Everyone admired the philanthropic gesture, but the reality was far more humiliating for them. Requests for donations, grant approvals, and public appearances tied to these initiatives were constant, and because they had no control, they had to rely on intermediaries to manage the process. They were constantly reminded of my wealth and their irrelevance to it. Daniel fumed at being forced into public appearances under the guise of family philanthropy. He had always craved respect and authority, yet now he was a figurehead for decisions he couldn't influence. Rebecca, who had thrived on control and meticulous planning, had to answer for acts of generosity she did not dictate. Every media story and social post tied her name to something she could not control. Michael, the one who had drifted, had to maintain appearances as well, constantly confronted by the fact that his inaction years ago had placed him at the mercy of my design. Meanwhile, I turned to the one who had remained loyal, my youngest sibling, Emily. She had quietly pawned her belongings to help me, showing more heart than any of the others combined. I made her the executor of one of the trusts, co-heir of a portion of my fortune, and partner in the philanthropic initiatives. Her life changed overnight, not because she sought wealth, but because she had acted with genuine concern. She had seen my need and extended herself, and now she had influence, access, and security, exactly what my other siblings had spurned. The final pleasure was personal. I never needed to gloat in front of Daniel and Rebecca again. Their public humiliation and the constant frustration of powerlessness were enough. But I allowed myself one last touch, an informal gathering where I invited the family, not to announce my generosity, but to reveal the structures. I explained how the trusts worked, how control was divided, and how none of them could access a cent without oversight. The realization hit them hard. Michael's face went pale. You control everything?" he asked, voice small. I smiled softly. "Everything that matters. Everything you chose to ignore." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. This isn't fair." "Fairness," I said, calm and precise, "is earned, and none of you earned it." Daniel scowled, fists clenched. You're playing us." "I'm simply holding a mirror," I replied. "And the reflection is exactly what you showed me." After that night, the dynamic was permanent. Emily and I worked together, building charitable projects that genuinely made a difference, while my other siblings were forced to live under the invisible but undeniable weight of their choices. They were publicly seen as generous, yet privately powerless, constantly reminded that I had anticipated every move they might make. I never needed to confront them again. Every time I thought of the past betrayals, I felt the satisfaction of justice, not vengeance. Daniel's arrogance had been tempered, Rebecca's manipulation contained, and Michael's indifference exposed. And for Emily, the reward of loyalty was tangible: influence, wealth, and recognition she had never asked for but truly deserved. As I stood one evening looking out over my city from my penthouse, champagne in hand, I reflected on the journey. Betrayal had shown me their true colors, but I had transformed that pain into power. I had painted the world with my own design, rewarding integrity and punishing deceit. And in that quiet moment, I smiled, thinking, they showed me who they were, so I became exactly who I needed to be. The world had shifted, the debts were repaid, and the final act was complete.